The sun was barely up over Lagos when chaos erupted in the Thompson family compound. Balloons lay scattered, cake smeared across the polished floor, and the sound of children's laughter had been replaced by the cruel jeers of men in uniforms. Police officers, supposed guardians of the community, had barged in without warning, accusing the birthday party of disturbing public order. James Thompson's 8-year-old son, Kofi, clutched his Spider-Man cake, tears streaking his chocolate-smeared cheeks. While his friends hid behind overturned chairs, James had tried to reason with them, his voice firm but calm, citing every legal right he knew. His words fell on ears, deafened by arrogance and power. One officer laughed as he shoved James to the ground, mocking him in front of the children. "Boy, know your place." The humiliation was complete, the outrage immediate. And James knew deep down that this wasn't about noise complaints or public order. It was about power, control, and racial bias disguised as authority. But amidst the chaos, James's phone buzzed. A single call, made in quiet desperation to someone with real authority, would change everything. One call that would unravel careers, expose corruption, and restore dignity to his son's stolen celebration. What happened next would leave the city talking for months. James Thompson had never imagined that a simple birthday party could become a battlefield. A respected community organizer and father of 2, he had spent the last decade building safe spaces for children in his East Lagos neighborhood. His days were filled with meetings, volunteer initiatives, and mentoring programs for teenagers who had nowhere else to go. Despite the daily challenges of crime, poverty, and bureaucratic indifference, James believed in the goodness of people and in the possibility of change. He carried that belief into every action, teaching his son Kofi that courage and kindness were the real measures of strength. Kofi was James's pride and joy. Bright, curious, and full of energy, the boy had recently turned 8 and was ecstatic for his birthday. James had spent weeks organizing a small celebration in their family compound, a Spider-Man-themed party complete with decorations, games, and a cake that Kofi had helped design himself. Neighbors and friends were invited. It was meant to be a day of laughter, community, and love, a brief escape from the harsh realities of life in the city. But James also knew that even ordinary joys could be fragile in a world where power often overshadowed justice. The Thompson family's neighborhood had long been a target for predatory behavior by certain elements within the local police. Complaints about harassment, extortion, and intimidation were whispered at street corners and in community centers. Families spoke in hushed tones about officers who showed favoritism toward wealthier residents while singling out hardworking citizens like the Thompsons. James had witnessed enough of this to understand that respectability alone offered no shield. His own past encounters with law enforcement had left him cautious but unbroken, determined to find solutions within the system rather than outside it. The morning of the party, James had woken early, making sure everything was perfect for Kofi and his friends. Balloons were tied to every gate, colorful banners hung across the yard, and a freshly baked cake rested on the center table. The smell of fried chicken and jollof rice filled the air, promising a feast for children and adults alike. Kofi ran around with his friends, laughing at games of tag and sack races. For a few fleeting hours, the neighborhood felt alive in a way that James hadn't seen in years, a community coming together to celebrate joy rather than survival. Then, without warning, the first police vehicle rolled into the compound. Its arrival was sudden, almost theatrical, and immediately alarming. James recognized some of the officers' men, who had a reputation for brutality and corruption, but he had never imagined they would interfere in something as personal as a child's birthday. The lead officer, Lieutenant Ademi, strutted toward the gate, his expression a mix of amusement and condescension. "Public disturbance complaint," Ademi announced as if it were a formality. "We're here to ensure the law is enforced." James' protests were met with laughter. He stepped forward, holding his phone as though it were a shield. "This is my son's birthday. There is no disturbance, only children playing. We are within our rights." Ademi smirked. "Rights? Boy, know your place. We run this community. The officers entered, overturning tables and scattering gifts. Kofi screamed, clutching his cake while James was shoved to the ground. Neighbors gathered, some too frightened to intervene, others recording the chaos on their phones. James' heart raced, not just with fear for his son, but with anger at the injustice unfolding before him. These were supposed to be public servants, tasked with protecting citizens. Yet they were acting as tyrants in their own fiefdom. In the midst of the assault, James' thoughts turned to the one option he had left, the number he had been given months earlier. A direct line to a federal investigator known for taking complaints seriously. It was unconventional, risky, and potentially dangerous for both him and his family, but he knew that ordinary channels would not stop these officers. With trembling hands, he dialed. Each ring stretched like an eternity. Kofi's sobs filled his ears as he pressed the phone to his side, whispering to his son, "Daddy's going to fix this, Kofi. Just watch, it's going to be okay." The line clicked. A calm, authoritative voice answered, listening intently as James described the scene, the intimidation, the false allegations, the humiliation of an 8-year-old boy. By the time he finished, James felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't about individual complaints anymore, it was about systemic abuse. And someone on the other end understood the stakes. Minutes later, the chaos began to subside, not because the officers left voluntarily, but because federal agents had quietly arrived, blending into the neighborhood. Observing, documenting, and preparing to act. James held Kofi close, whispering reassurances, knowing that what they were witnessing could change everything. The day that began as a nightmare was about to become the first chapter in a much larger story, one that would expose entrenched corruption, challenge the abuse of authority, and restore dignity to a family and a community. Kofi's birthday, stolen in the moment, would become the catalyst for accountability, federal investigation, and ultimately justice. By the afternoon, the neighborhood was buzzing, not with fear, but with cautious optimism. Word spread quickly that James had made the call. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the rare intervention, a reminder that power could be challenged and that ordinary citizens had a voice when they dared to act. James knew this was only the beginning. The officers who had terrorized the celebration would soon face consequences far beyond the walls of his compound. As he looked at Kofi, whose tear-streaked face was slowly softening into curiosity and hope, James made a silent promise. No child in this community would have to fear birthdays, graduations, or neighborhood celebrations ever again. If the law failed to protect them, he would find those who could. And in that promise, James found the courage to confront a system that had long favored the powerful over the innocent. This was more than a birthday party, it was a turning point. A single phone call had the potential to dismantle careers, unravel corruption, and restore faith in justice. James knew that the road ahead would be long, dangerous, and exhausting. But he also knew that courage, careful planning, and unwavering commitment to truth could prevail. The Thompson family's ordeal had begun, but so had the fight for justice. And by the end of it, no officer who abused their power would walk away unscathed. The chaos of Kofi's birthday party lingered in James Thompson's mind long after the officers had been restrained by federal agents. The initial shock of humiliation had given way to a burning determination. He knew the officers involved, Lieutenant Ademi, Sergeant Balagan, and several others, had relied on fear and unchecked authority for years, and today their arrogance had finally met its match. What had seemed like an isolated incident, a violent overreach at a child's party, now appeared to James as a window into something much larger. By the evening of the party, federal agents had interviewed every neighbor who witnessed the events. Smartphones, security cameras, and neighborhood CCTV had captured everything in harrowing detail. The footage showed officers overturning tables, grabbing children's presents, and even pushing James to the ground in front of Kofi. Every word spoken by the officers was recorded. Their laughter as Kofi cried, their casual threats, and their boastful remarks about using their badges to assert dominance. Every ounce of arrogance was documented for the first time in a way that could not be ignored. James spent the night going over the recordings with his wife, Maya, who had taken the room to calm him down. Watching the footage, James felt a mix of anger, sadness, and awe at the audacity of the officers. "This is beyond corruption," he whispered to Maya. "This is systematic abuse, and they've been getting away with it for years. We can't let it go." Maya nodded, holding her husband's hand tightly. "Then we make sure they don't. Kofi's not the only one who deserves protection." The next morning, James met with the lead federal agent, Ada Okoye, a calm but determined officer who specialized in civil rights violations and organized crime. Agent Okoye had a reputation for unraveling complex corruption networks within local police departments. Sitting in her temporary office in the community center, James handed over the recordings, photographs, and witness statements he had collected during the party. "These aren't just rogue officers," he told her. "They've been targeting families, blocking events, and making our community unsafe for years. Today, it happened to my son, but it's been happening to countless others." Agent Okoye listened attentively, flipping through the files with a practiced eye. "You're right, Mr. Thompson," she said. "And that's why what you've documented is invaluable. A single viral incident draws attention, but your evidence shows a pattern. And patterns are what we need to prosecute systemic abuse. These officers won't be able to hide behind local bureaucracy anymore." Meanwhile, back at the police precinct, word of the federal intervention spread quickly, sending ripples of panic through the ranks. Lieutenant Ademi, who had spent years cultivating a sense of invincibility, found himself in uncharted territory. His phone rang continuously with calls from lawyers, supervisors, and sympathetic colleagues trying to assess the scope of federal involvement. No one had ever dared challenge him publicly, and the sight of federal agents controlling the scene at the Thompson home shattered the illusion of untouchable authority. Sergeant Balagan paced his office, shaking his head in disbelief. How did they get involved this fast? Nobody reports to the feds without local approval. He knew the answer, of course. James Thompson had acted decisively and courageously. But he also knew that the damage to their careers and potentially their freedom had already begun. Rumors of disciplinary actions, media coverage, and potential criminal charges spread through the precinct like wildfire. Officers who had previously laughed at community complaints now whispered anxiously among themselves, wondering who would be next to face consequences. James and Agent Okoye began the painstaking work of cataloging evidence. Every photograph, audio recording, and witness testimony was cross-referenced with police activity logs, social media reports, and community event calendars. The scope of misconduct became terrifyingly clear. Over the past 5 years, the officers in question had targeted dozens of community gatherings, including birthday parties, graduations, church events, and neighborhood block parties. The patterns were unmistakable: disruption, intimidation, humiliation, and in some cases, false arrests. These were not isolated mistakes. This was organized, intentional harassment. Community members began coming forward with stories. Mrs. Ebel Washington, a grandmother who had seen her grandson's graduation celebration ruined, shared photographs and receipts from a day when officers had confiscated banners, overturned chairs, and falsely accused children of vandalism. "They made my grandson kneel in the dirt," she told investigators. "And then they laughed while we tried to pick up what they destroyed. My husband's faith in law enforcement is gone. But maybe today, someone will finally hold them accountable." Her statement, recorded and corroborated by multiple neighbors, became one of the early pieces of damning evidence in the case. The federal investigation quickly revealed financial improprieties tied to the offending officers. Agent Okoye uncovered transfers from union funds to personal accounts, suspicious reimbursements for equipment never purchased, and unexplained cash deposits following certain community interventions. While the officers had flaunted power in public spaces, they had also built a network of corruption behind closed doors, exploiting their positions for monetary gain. This evidence, combined with testimony and digital documentation, began forming the framework of a comprehensive civil rights and criminal case. Meanwhile, James found himself grappling with the emotional toll of the ordeal. Kofi, though resilient, asked questions about why the officers had been so mean and why adults sometimes abused power. "Daddy, did they hate us?" he asked one evening, clutching a Spider-Man action figure. James struggled to explain systemic injustice to his son, hoping to balance honesty with reassurance. "They weren't just mean, Kofi," he said gently. "They forgot what it means to protect people. But we're going to make sure nobody else has to be afraid like you were today." That's why courage matters, even when it's hard. Community sentiment began shifting as word of the federal investigation spread. Residents who had long felt powerless began to feel hope. Groups organized neighborhood watches, documented prior harassment, and volunteered statements to support James's case. Churches opened their doors for community meetings where parents could share experiences, file complaints, and learn their rights. The birthday party, once a symbol of fear and humiliation, had become the spark for mobilizing a community long subjected to intimidation. At the precinct, officers like Ademi and Balagan were now on edge. Internal communications revealed panic and finger-pointing. Emails were deleted, conversations moved to private lines, and long-standing alliances within the force began to fracture. For years, the officers had relied on a culture of silence and loyalty to shield themselves from scrutiny. That culture was now under assault. The fear of exposure and the prospect of federal prosecution began eroding their confidence. The same tactics they had wielded to control the community were now ineffective in protecting themselves. Agent Okoye recognized the opportunity to expand the investigation. She coordinated with forensic accountants, IT specialists, and other federal agents to analyze phone records, bank statements, and digital communications. Every community complaint, every suspicious transaction, and every recorded officer conversation became a piece of the puzzle. The web of misconduct extended far beyond the Thompson family, implicating multiple precincts and even revealing the possibility of coordinated schemes between officers, local politicians, and private contractors during this period. James also became an active participant in the investigation. He spent long hours reviewing evidence, contacting witnesses, and assisting federal agents in understanding community dynamics. He documented his own experiences with meticulous detail, noting times, locations, and officer behavior, providing context that numbers and recordings alone could not convey. His dual role as both victim and investigator added credibility to the case while ensuring that the narrative of abuse was accurately preserved. The officers' attempts to intimidate community members continued, but with diminishing effect. Where they once relied on fear, the Thompson family and their neighbors now wielded resilience and documentation. A small viral video of the officers' harassment at the birthday party circulated online, drawing national attention. Journalists interviewed families, showing images of overturned tables and Kofi's destroyed Spider-Man cake. Social media campaigns raised awareness, demanding accountability. The officers who had once controlled the streets now faced public scrutiny they could not suppress. By the end of the first month following the party, federal authorities had compiled enough preliminary evidence to consider arrests. Agent Okoye and her team held a strategy meeting, discussing how to approach each suspect without tipping off others who might attempt to destroy evidence. They considered chain of command implications, patterns of harassment, and financial trails. Each officer's involvement was weighed against the cumulative harm caused to families, neighborhoods, and children like Kofi. The investigation was no longer about a single birthday party. It was about dismantling a network of abuse. As the first arrests were planned, the community rallied around the Thompsons. Volunteers provided childcare, meals, and moral support. Kofi began to understand that his birthday, though marred by violence, had sparked something far greater than any party could have achieved. He watched as neighbors shared stories, filed reports, and worked with federal agents to reclaim a sense of justice. The birthday that once symbolized fear was now a beacon of accountability. The first wave of arrests was swift. Lieutenant Ademi, Sergeant Balagan, and 3 other officers were taken into custody with little warning. The news spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through the precinct and the city. The officers' colleagues, previously silent or complicit, began realizing the magnitude of what was happening. Some reached out to federal authorities, offering information in exchange for leniency. Others panicked, attempting to hide evidence or mislead investigators. The unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back. For James and Maya, the emotional strain remained intense. Every day brought new revelations, hearings, and interviews. They worried about Kofi's well-being, the safety of their family, and the relentless scrutiny that came with being central figures in a high-profile federal investigation. But they also felt a growing sense of empowerment. Their courage to make that one phone call had set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only their family's life but also the lives of countless others in their community. By the time the dust began to settle on the first arrests, it was clear that the Thompson birthday party had catalyzed something extraordinary. Officers who had wielded authority with impunity were now facing consequences. Community leaders who had long been silenced were speaking out. Families who had been intimidated were stepping forward. And Kofi, for all the fear he had endured, had become an unlikely symbol of resilience and courage. A reminder that even the smallest voice, when amplified with truth and bravery, could challenge the most entrenched systems of power. As Part 1 drew to a close, the scene was set for a broader confrontation. The federal investigation had only begun to scratch the surface of widespread abuse, corruption, and intimidation. James Thompson and his family had turned a day of personal devastation into the starting point for systemic accountability. The coming weeks would reveal the true depth of the network, the lengths officers had gone to protect themselves, and the power of ordinary citizens to demand justice. The following morning, James Thompson awoke to a flurry of notifications on his phone. Messages from neighbors, journalists, and even distant relatives poured in, each one a mix of concern, gratitude, and outrage. The story of Kofi's birthday party had gone viral overnight. Clips of the officers overturning tables, shoving chairs, and laughing as terrified children cried were circulating across social media platforms. Hashtags demanding accountability were trending nationally. James felt a mix of pride and unease: pride that the world was seeing the truth, unease at the intense scrutiny his family now faced. Agent Ada Okoye had scheduled a follow-up meeting with James and Maya to discuss next steps. Sitting in a small conference room at the community center, Agent Okoye laid out a plan for the next phase of the investigation. "We've documented the immediate incident," she began, "but what we need now is context. Patterns, connections, financial trails, communications, anything that proves these officers acted deliberately and systematically." She paused, making eye contact with James. "We're not just holding them accountable for one day. We're exposing years of abuse and corruption." James nodded, determination etched into his features. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "I've already gathered testimonies from other families who've been targeted. I'll help you track down documents, emails, anything they used to cover themselves. They can't hide anymore," Maya added, "and we'll make sure Kofi knows that standing up for what's right matters, even if it's scary." The team began analyzing phone records and digital communications. What they discovered shocked them. Officer Ademi had maintained multiple burner phones, each used to coordinate harassment campaigns, falsify reports, and intimidate community members. Emails revealed conversations between officers planning interventions at events weeks in advance, complete with diagrams, checklists, and notes about which families were considered easy targets. Financial records showed kickbacks from contractors, suspicious reimbursements, and even small bribes to local business owners to ensure access to private properties. While the investigation focused on financial and digital evidence, the human cost of the officers' actions became more apparent. Families came forward with stories of intimidation, humiliation, and fear that had lingered for years. One mother, Mrs. Chika Ez, recounted a time when her daughter's church picnic was destroyed. "They pushed my daughter to the ground, took our food, and told us we'd learn a lesson for knowing our place," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I never thought anyone would believe us, but now there's hope." The emotional weight of these testimonies was immense. James and Maya, while focused on evidence, also had to manage Kofi's understanding of the situation. The young boy was resilient but perceptive, often asking questions that cut to the heart of injustice. "Daddy, why do they hurt people for fun?" he asked one evening. James sighed, struggling to answer in a way that was honest yet comforting. "Sometimes people forget what's right," he said. "But we're making sure they face the truth. That's why courage matters. It protects others from being hurt in the same way." Meanwhile, the officers under investigation were growing increasingly desperate. Lieutenant Ademi, aware of the mounting evidence, attempted to rally his colleagues, urging them to coordinate their stories and obscure the digital trails. Sergeant Balagan tried to discredit witnesses, leaking misleading information to the press and accusing James of fabricating evidence. But each attempt only deepened suspicion. Federal agents, with access to forensic specialists, quickly identified inconsistencies, tracing communications back to the officers' original sources. Every lie unraveled under scrutiny, exposing the systemic nature of the abuse. In one critical breakthrough, forensic analysts discovered that Officer Balagan had attempted to delete incriminating messages from a secure chat app. Using specialized software, the agents recovered deleted texts, revealing plans to disrupt not only private parties but also community fundraisers, school events, and local festivals. These messages painted a disturbing picture of premeditated harassment, showing that the officers had treated entire neighborhoods as playgrounds for their abuse of power. Public outrage intensified as news outlets began reporting on the depth of the investigation. Journalists interviewed families, showcased recovered communications, and analyzed financial records. Editorials criticized the officers' behavior and called for systemic reform. The Thompson family became a symbol of ordinary citizens standing up against abuse, and Kofi, despite his age, became a figure of resilience. Videos of him bravely confronting the officers at his party were shared widely, inspiring communities across the country. James and Agent Okoye also focused on the broader network of complicity. They discovered that some local politicians and community leaders had tacitly supported the officers' actions, either by turning a blind eye or by actively obstructing complaints. This revelation was crucial. Holding the officers accountable required exposing those who enabled them, showing that the abuse was not isolated but embedded in a culture of impunity. During this phase, the emotional stakes remained high. Maya, who had spent months advocating for justice, often felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She organized meetings with other affected families, helping them document incidents and prepare for testimony. The process was exhausting, emotionally draining, and at times frightening, but the community's solidarity provided strength. Parents, grandparents, and neighbors worked together, ensuring their voices were heard and that no one would face the officers alone. Amid this tension, Kofi found ways to contribute in his own small way. Encouraged by his parents, he recorded short messages about fairness, courage, and standing up against wrongdoing. These clips, shared online, resonated with many who had faced similar abuse. Kofi's innocence, courage, and clarity reminded everyone involved of the human cost behind the statistics. Emails and financial records, the officers, sensing the tightening net around them, resorted to intimidation tactics aimed at James and his family. Anonymous threats appeared in the Thompson mailbox. Suspicious vehicles were spotted near their home, and social media posts attempted to discredit James. But these tactics only strengthened the resolve of the Thompsons and their allies. Agent Okoye coordinated with local law enforcement and federal protection services to ensure their safety, making it clear that retaliation would only escalate the consequences for the officers. In one pivotal moment, a neighbor's security camera captured a Ademi and Balagan meeting late at night in a public park. The footage, recovered by federal analysts, revealed discussions about concealing evidence and coordinating false alibis. The agents cross-referenced the timestamps with deleted phone logs and financial transactions, creating an irrefutable chain of evidence. This breakthrough allowed the federal team to issue subpoenas for the officers' personal devices, banking information, and internal communications. As the investigation expanded, It became evident that the officers' network extended into multiple precincts. Intimidation and financial corruption were mirrored in other communities, suggesting systemic issues within the local police infrastructure. Agent Okoye briefed James and Maya on the next phase, building a case not only against the immediate offenders but also against higher-ranking officials who had enabled or ignored the abuse. This meant more interviews, more evidence collection, and more public attention. Despite the pressure, the Thompson family and the community remained focused on the goal: accountability. Town hall meetings, social media campaigns, and press conferences became routine. Families shared their stories, providing emotional context to the digital and financial evidence. The narrative was clear: the officers' actions were deliberate, harmful, and part of a larger pattern of abuse. The community's voice was now amplified, leaving no room for the officers to manipulate the story or escape responsibility. As arrests loomed, Ademi and Balogun grew increasingly frantic. They attempted to enlist the help of sympathetic colleagues, offering bribes and favors in exchange for false testimony. But the federal investigation was thorough, leaving no room for manipulation. Each attempt at obstruction was documented, creating additional charges that would compound the officers' legal jeopardy. Their careers, once untouchable, were unraveling rapidly. James reflected on how far they had come since that fateful birthday party. What had begun as a personal act of courage calling federal authorities had grown into a nationwide movement for accountability and reform. The community, once silenced by fear, was now empowered. Kofi, whose tears had once symbolized innocence violated, now represented resilience, courage, and the possibility of change. By the end of Part 2, the first wave of arrests had been executed. Lieutenant Ademi, Sergeant Balogun, and several accomplices were taken into custody, their reputations in ruins and their future uncertain. The community celebrated cautiously, aware that the investigation was far from over. Federal authorities continued to dig deeper, uncovering more evidence, more connections, and more opportunities to deliver justice. The Thompson family, though exhausted, remained at the center of the effort. They had become not only witnesses, but active participants in a movement that promised to reshape the local justice system. And as Kofi smiled at the news of the officer's arrest, he understood in his own way that standing up for what is right, no matter how small the act, can ripple out to create monumental change. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Families whose lives had been upended by the officers' actions filled the front rows, holding signs and photographs from the destroyed birthday parties, blocked community events, and unjust arrests. News crews jostled for position, capturing every glance, every whisper, every trembling hand. James and Naya sat together, Kofi perched between them. Clutching his Spider-Man backpack like a talisman of courage, the first to testify was Mrs. Chika Ez. She recounted the church picnic where officers had humiliated her daughter, overturning tables and confiscating food while threatening the families with fines and arrest. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she described the fear and confusion her children experienced. They wanted to make us small, to remind us that we had no power, she said, looking directly at the officers in the gallery. But today I stand here because we do have power, the power to speak truth and demand justice. The jury nodded, visibly moved by her testimony. Next, Agent Ada Okoye presented the digital evidence. A large monitor displayed a timeline of harassing activities spanning multiple precincts. Emails, phone logs, and GPS data pinpointed officers at the scene of every targeted event. Deleted messages, recovered through forensic software, revealed coordinated plans to disrupt graduations, block parties, and neighborhood fundraisers. Each piece of evidence reinforced a chilling narrative. These were not isolated incidents, but deliberate acts of intimidation executed with bureaucratic precision. Lieutenant Ademi, seated at the defendant's table, shifted uncomfortably. His colleagues avoided eye contact, their bravado from the street and social media evaporating under the weight of federal scrutiny. The defense attorney attempted to frame the evidence as coincidental, claiming that officers were responding to legitimate complaints. But the timeline, corroborated by dozens of eyewitnesses, left little room for doubt. Then came the testimony that shook the courtroom. James Thompson himself. He recounted the events of Kofi's birthday party in vivid detail: the laughter, the shouts, the overturned cake, and the humiliation he endured at the hands of the officers. His voice was calm but firm. "They saw a moment of joy and turned it into a display of power," he said. But that moment also revealed the larger truth. These officers believed they could terrorize entire communities with impunity. They underestimated the courage of ordinary people standing together. Kofi, encouraged by his parents, was next. Despite being only 9, he spoke with remarkable clarity. "The bad police ruined my birthday party," he said, looking directly at the officers. "They made my daddy kneel in the dirt. They scared my friends. But my daddy was protecting everyone. He was brave, and now the bad police are in trouble because good always wins when people are brave." Gasps filled the courtroom, some jurors visibly moved, others wiping tears from their eyes. The child's testimony crystallized the human cost of the officer's actions in a way no document or recording could. The prosecution then introduced Officer Luis Nwankwo, a whistleblower whose courage had been pivotal to the investigation. Nwankwo, a 14-year veteran of the force, had secretly documented years of harassment, intimidation, and corruption. Sitting before the jury, he explained how officers would plan disruptions weeks in advance, using burner phones, coded language, and intimidation tactics to avoid detection. "We weren't enforcing the law," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "We were controlling communities. We targeted children, families, and anyone who dared celebrate or organize. And we did it with pride, believing we were untouchable." The evidence Nwankwo provided was staggering. Thousands of photographs showed officers at disrupted events, financial records detailed illicit payments and bribes, and audio recordings captured the casual cruelty of officers mocking their victims. One recording, played in court, revealed Lieutenant Ademi instructing junior officers on the psychology of fear, advising them to humiliate parents in front of their children to teach them compliance. Another captured Sergeant Balogun discussing how to coerce local business owners into supporting the harassment campaigns financially. As the trial progressed, the officers' attempts to defend themselves began to crumble. Their lawyers tried to argue selective prosecution, claiming federal overreach and misinterpretation of events. But the evidence was too comprehensive, too systematic, and too corroborated. Internal communications revealed supervisors approving harassment campaigns, while financial records connected illicit payments to high-ranking officials. The narrative of individual misconduct fell apart under the weight of a conspiracy meticulously documented over years. Outside the courtroom, the community rallied. Volunteers organized support for families, coordinated media outreach, and ensured that their voices remained central to the narrative. Social media campaigns highlighted each testimony, amplifying the human stories behind the legal proceedings. Kofi's classmates, neighbors, and other children who had been witnesses or victims shared artwork, letters, and videos expressing solidarity and gratitude. The case became more than just a legal battle, it was a cultural moment, a testament to resilience and collective action. One particularly dramatic day in court, the prosecution called former Deputy Chief Nnamdi Okoro, who had reluctantly admitted to overseeing some of the operations. Under intense questioning, he revealed how systemic corruption allowed officers to act without consequence. Complaints were dismissed, he said. Internal affairs turned a blind eye. Political connections shielded us. The pattern was clear, but no one wanted to intervene. His testimony shocked a jury, providing insight into how deeply entrenched the culture of impunity had become. As the trial unfolded, James and Maya became central figures in public discussions about policing, accountability, and community resilience. They were interviewed by news outlets, invited to speak at town halls, and featured in articles highlighting the human dimension of systemic abuse. Their voices, grounded in experience and integrity, reinforced the moral imperative behind the legal proceedings. Meanwhile, the officers, facing the cumulative weight of evidence, began turning on each other. Emails and phone logs exposed attempts to shift blame, falsify timelines, and intimidate witnesses. Each revelation added new charges, increasing both the severity of potential sentences and the public's understanding of the scope of abuse. The prosecution highlighted these patterns, showing that the officers had conspired not only to harass but also to obstruct justice, ensuring that accountability would be comprehensive during cross-examination. Officer Adami's arrogance began to falter. He had previously boasted about manipulating community members and evading consequences, but the courtroom was no longer a domain he could control. Witnesses' emotional testimonies combined with irrefutable digital and financial evidence dismantled every claim. Adami's defiance gradually gave way to visible frustration and anger. His carefully constructed persona, crumbling under scrutiny, one pivotal moment came when a social worker testified about the long-term psychological effects of the harassment on children. She described anxiety, nightmares, and mistrust that lingered in the community for years. Kofi's own trauma was contextualized within this broader framework, demonstrating that the officers' actions had real, measurable impacts on human lives. The jury saw not only the systemic nature of the crimes but also their tangible consequences. Deepening the emotional weight of the case, the media coverage of the trial intensified, with news outlets emphasizing the unprecedented scale of the investigation and prosecution. National commentators debated the implications for law enforcement reform, community trust, and federal oversight. Public support for the Thompsons and other affected families surged, while the officers faced increasing scrutiny from both the public and professional peers. In preparation for the final phase of testimony, James and Maya worked closely with the prosecution team to ensure that all evidence was presented cohesively. Digital timelines, photographs, audio recordings, and financial records were meticulously organized. Families who had been hesitant to come forward were encouraged to participate, ensuring a comprehensive narrative that left no gaps. Every testimony, every document, and every visual aid was aimed at demonstrating the systematic, deliberate nature of the officers' misconduct. As the courtroom drama reached its climax, Kofi's voice became unexpectedly pivotal. He was allowed to read a short statement he had prepared with his parents' guidance. "The bad police thought they could scare us and hurt people for fun," he said, his voice clear and confident. "But we stood together. My daddy and our neighbors were brave. They showed me that good people can win when they do what's right." The jury, the audience, and even the officers themselves were visibly affected. The child's testimony, simple yet profound, crystallized the moral center of the trial in a way that no technical evidence could. By the end of Part 3, the jury had a complete understanding of the systematic abuse, the complicity of supervisors, the financial incentives, and the human impact. The case was no longer about a single birthday party, it was about accountability, justice, and the restoration of community trust. Families who had suffered for years felt a sense of empowerment, knowing that their stories would lead to real consequences. The officers, once untouchable, now faced the stark reality of their actions, and the legal and social repercussions they could no longer evade. The courtroom buzzed with tense anticipation as Part 4 of the trial began. Families of victims sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces etched with anxiety, determination, and a simmering hope for justice. The media coverage outside was relentless. Every major news outlet in the city ran live updates, highlighting the unprecedented scale of the case and the human stories behind it. James and Maya sat at the front, flanking Kofi, who had spent the morning nervously clutching his Spider-Man backpack. Now a symbol of courage rather than fear, the prosecution opened the session by presenting the final phase of evidence: the direct financial links that revealed how officers had personally profited from their actions. Large charts projected onto the courtroom screen illustrated a tangled web of illicit payments, drug trafficking proceeds, and union fund manipulations. Each line on the chart connected officers to another, creating a clear depiction of systemic corruption. Agent Ada Okoye explained that the operation wasn't merely opportunistic. It was structured, organized, and sustained over years, demonstrating intent at every level. One audio recording played that left the courtroom in stunned silence. Lieutenant Adami's voice, casual and almost jovial, instructed officers on using community events to extract bribes and manipulate local businesses. Every block party, every graduation, every birthday opportunity, he said, his tone disturbingly light. Keep them scared, keep them dependent, keep them under our control. The simplicity of the language combined with the horrifying intent behind it drew audible gasps from the gallery. Even seasoned federal prosecutors exchanged grim looks. Witness after witness testified about the daily impact of harassment and intimidation. Reverend Naji described how parishioners avoided attending services for fear of being targeted by police. Parents recounted how children no longer felt safe playing in their neighborhoods, and small business owners shared how they'd been coerced into paying community fees under threat of raids and citations. Each account built a mosaic of suffering, clearly illustrating the consequences of deliberate, institutionalized misconduct. James was called to the stand once again. This time, his focus was on the broader social implications of the officers' actions. It wasn't just about my son's birthday party, he explained. It was about the message they sent to every family, every child, every business owner in our community. They wanted people to believe they had no power. They were wrong. Today, our courage and truth are restoring that power. His words resonated deeply. Even the officers in the gallery lowered their heads, confronted by the human consequences of their arrogance. Maya followed, detailing the emotional toll and the months of surveillance and fear they endured. She described the community meetings where neighbors confided in her about harassment, her sleepless nights worrying about retaliation, and the painstaking documentation that helped build the case. This is not vengeance, she said, voice steady despite tears. This is accountability. And accountability is the only way to prevent future harm. Her testimony was met with hushed nods from jurors and murmurs of agreement from the gallery. Then came Kofi. The young boy had prepared a drawing board filled with illustrations showing the timeline of the officer's harassment. He walked slowly to the stand, holding the board with trembling hands, and pointed to each picture as he recounted events. His small voice carried across the courtroom, clear and unwavering. The bad police came to my birthday party. They ruined my cake. They made my daddy kneel. They were mean to my friends. But now they are going away, and we can celebrate safely. The combination of innocence, clarity, and courage rendered everyone in the room silent. No evidence could have captured the moral weight of that testimony more powerfully than the child who had lived it. Next, Officer Waisnuankwo took the stand again, describing the internal mechanisms that had allowed the corruption to persist. He explained how complaints were dismissed, investigations stalled, and promotions were awarded to those who played along. His insider perspective was crucial, revealing how deeply entrenched the system was and how few officers had dared resist. I stayed silent for too long, he admitted, voice heavy with regret. But seeing Agent Thompson's bravery inspired me to act. No more silence. No more protection of the corrupt. The prosecution then presented the final recordings, showing conversations where officers discussed specific tactics to disrupt children's events, harass parents, and manipulate community leaders. One particularly damning clip captured Lieutenant Adami training new recruits. Arrests aren't the point, he explained. Humiliation is. Break their spirit before they can organize. Fear is your tool. The clarity of intent, paired with the meticulous planning, left little room for defense. Every officer in the courtroom could no longer claim ignorance or accident. The actions were deliberate and coordinated. During cross-examination, defense attorneys tried to deflect blame onto the culture of the department, arguing that officers were following standard practices and responding to legitimate complaints. But each claim was methodically dismantled. Emails, logs, recordings, and eyewitness testimony left no ambiguity. These were not isolated misjudgments but systematic violations of constitutional rights. Even the attempts to portray the Thompsons and the community as overreacting fell flat under the weight of overwhelming evidence. Public interest in the case had reached fever pitch. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of residents gathered to show support for the victims. The severity of potential local community groups organized safe spaces for children and families to attend the trial in person. News crews interviewed parents, neighbors, and community leaders, emphasizing the emotional and societal impact of the officers' actions. Social media campaigns shared images and videos of testimony, reinforcing the importance of accountability and inspiring similar efforts in neighboring cities. One of the most poignant moments of the trial came when James presented a detailed map showing every disrupted community event over the past 5 years. Birthdays, block parties, graduations, church fundraisers, youth sports leagues, all plotted chronologically to demonstrate the pattern of harassment. Each red dot on the map represented not just an event but a family traumatized, a child frightened, a neighborhood destabilized. The visualization was both horrifying and compelling, leaving the jury and spectators with a tangible understanding of the scope of abuse. Kofi's school principal testified about the lasting emotional effects on children, describing instances of withdrawal, nightmares, and loss of trust in authority figures. "Our children no longer believe they were safe in their own communities," she said. "It took months of counseling and support just to rebuild basic trust." The actions of these officers have a ripple effect that extends far beyond what you see in a single courtroom. The jurors scribbled notes, clearly grappling with the human costs beyond the legal violations. As the trial approached its final days, the prosecution summarized the evidence, carefully connecting the human stories to the systematic corruption and harassment. Every timeline, every photograph, every recording reinforced the same conclusion. The officers had engaged in a coordinated campaign of intimidation, manipulation, and financial exploitation. Their power had been weaponized against the very communities they swore to serve. The defense made a final, desperate attempt to introduce character witnesses and argue that systemic pressure forced the officers into misconduct. But the jury had already seen the patterns, understood the intent, and recognized the human suffering. The plea for leniency fell on deaf ears, overshadowed by the comprehensive nature of the prosecution's evidence. In the closing arguments, U.S. Attorney Adebayo spoke with passion. "This case is about more than one birthday party," he declared. "It is about the lives affected, the children frightened, the families humiliated, and the communities destabilized by officers who believed they were above the law. But today, justice is not just a concept, it is real, tangible, and earned through courage, perseverance, and truth." The courtroom erupted in applause, restrained only by judicial decorum. Finally, the judge prepared to read the verdicts. Lieutenant Ademi and the other officers sat with tense expressions, their earlier confidence eroded. The community held its breath. When the first guilty verdict was announced, the courtroom filled with gasps and whispered exclamations. One by one, each officer was found guilty of civil rights violations, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The sentences were severe, reflecting the years of trauma inflicted on countless families. Lieutenant Ademi received 25 years, Sergeant Balogun 18 years, and Officer Shanidu 15 years. Each sentence was a testament to the scale of wrongdoing and the commitment of federal authorities to ensure accountability. As the officers were led away in handcuffs, families embraced, tears flowing freely. Children cheered, neighbors hugged, and James and Maya finally allowed themselves a long, exhausted sigh of relief. Kofi, now smiling for the first time in months, ran to the front of the courtroom to high-five his father. The moment was both intimate and profoundly symbolic. Justice had been served, and the community's resilience had been validated. The aftermath of the trial brought sweeping changes. Federal oversight was imposed on the entire police department, ensuring transparent complaint procedures, mandatory community engagement, and ongoing monitoring. Former officers who had participated in the harassment campaigns were permanently barred from law enforcement. Training programs were instituted to prevent systemic abuse, focusing on empathy, community partnership, and accountability. Community healing began in earnest. Marcus Thompson Community Justice Foundation, established by Maya and James, provided legal support, counseling, and educational programs for families affected by police misconduct. Youth mentorship programs paired children with reformed officers, turning past trauma into lessons in courage, resilience, and civic responsibility. Families who had once lived in fear now hosted block parties, graduations, and community fundraisers with confidence and safety. The story of the destroyed birthday party became a symbol of resistance, courage, and systemic change. It illustrated how ordinary families, supported by dedicated law enforcement and federal oversight, could challenge corruption and restore justice. The moral was clear: bravery, documentation, and community solidarity could overcome even the most entrenched abuse of power. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind a sense of solemn triumph. Families lingered in the hallways, holding one another, sharing quiet words of relief and hope. The cacophony of the media outside was now tempered by stories of courage, resilience, and community victory. James, Maya, and Kofi walked out together, their steps unhurried, absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. The boy's Spider-Man backpack bounced against his small shoulders. Now, a silent symbol of bravery rather than fear, outside the crowd erupted as news of the guilty verdicts spread. Neighbors cheered, waving banners with slogans like "Justice for Kofi" and "No More Silence." Children ran freely through the streets, their laughter a stark contrast to the silence that had hung over the neighborhood for months. Mothers hugged one another, and fathers clapped each other on the back, acknowledging the power of solidarity. The emotional release was palpable. For years, fear had dictated daily life, and now it was replaced by empowerment and hope. The Thompsons returned home, finally able to breathe without the shadow of intimidation looming over them. James reflected on the months of preparation, the long nights of documenting abuses, and the courage it had taken to speak up. He realized that accountability was not a simple process. It required patience, meticulous attention to detail, and an unwavering commitment to truth. But the reward was worth every moment. Justice had been restored, and a precedent had been set for every family who had once felt powerless. Maya sat beside her husband, holding his hand tightly. "It's not just about us," she said softly. "It's about every child who will feel safe again. Every family who knows their rights matter, every officer who will think twice before abusing power. We didn't just win for Kofi, we won for the community." Her words resonated deeply, capturing the moral essence of the story. Courage, action, and documentation could dismantle corruption and transform society. Kofi, oblivious to the political and legal complexities, focused on one thing: celebration. His eyes sparkled as he recounted the day's events to friends who had come over to mark his belated birthday. "They can't ruin parties anymore," he declared with innocent certainty. "The bad police are gone, and we can have fun." The simplicity of his perspective reminded everyone that the fight for justice was ultimately about preserving the joy, dignity, and innocence of children. In the weeks that followed, the community took proactive steps to ensure that no one could ever feel powerless again. Neighborhood watches were formed, community events were registered and monitored for safety, and dialogue with law enforcement became routine. The federal oversight team remained engaged, but residents felt a renewed sense of ownership over their own lives. For once, fear no longer dictated the rhythms of daily life. Empowerment, vigilance, and collaboration did. The story of the destroyed birthday party became a powerful lesson in civic engagement. Schools incorporated discussions about rights, responsibilities, and the importance of speaking up when injustice occurs. Youth mentorship programs paired children with adults who had experience in civic activism, teaching them that one phone call, one voice, or one act of courage could ignite systemic change. Every family that had suffered now had a roadmap for resilience, ensuring that the next generation would inherit not only safety but also the tools to defend it. James and Maya, once ordinary parents facing extraordinary intimidation, became pillars of the community. They were invited to speak at schools, community centers, and local government forums, sharing the story of their struggle and triumph. Their narrative illustrated the transformative power of accountability, courage, and persistence. Through their efforts, neighbors who had once felt powerless were inspired to take action, reinforcing a cycle of justice that would endure for years. The officers who had once wielded power with impunity now faced the reality of their choices. Their reputations shattered, careers ended, and public disgrace ensured that their actions could never be repeated. The moral was evident: abuse of authority carries consequences, and accountability is both inevitable and essential. Justice was not only served for one birthday party, it was served for every child, every family, and every community member who had been silenced or intimidated. Kofi's story, in particular, became a symbol of resilience and moral courage. Children across the city learned that even the smallest voice could make a difference. Schools displayed his drawings, chronicling the harassment and triumph, as visual reminders of the power of truth. Neighborhood walls featured murals depicting children standing up against injustice, ensuring that the lessons of courage, integrity, and solidarity were never forgotten. As the sun set over the city, James, Maya, and Kofi stood on their balcony overlooking the neighborhood. Music floated from the streets, laughter echoed from the playgrounds, and the aroma of home-cooked meals signaled normalcy returning to the community. James turned to his family, his heart full. "We did it," he said simply. "We reclaimed our lives, our dignity, and our community." Maya smiled, squeezing his hand while Kofi danced around them, his energy uncontainable and joyful. The final message of this story resonated far beyond the courtroom. Courage, documentation, and persistent advocacy can dismantle even the most entrenched systems of abuse. Fear may intimidate, but it cannot outlast integrity, truth, and solidarity. Communities that support one another, hold power accountable, and teach children to stand up for justice will always prevail. And so, from a ruined birthday party emerged a movement, a lesson, and a legacy. The Thompson struggle reminded everyone that even ordinary families possess extraordinary power when they unite against injustice. The community healed, laws were enforced, and a precedent was set. No abuse of authority would go unchallenged, and no child would have their innocence stolen without consequence. Justice had been served. But more importantly, hope had been restored. The story of Kofi's birthday became legend, not because of a party that was ruined, but because of the courage, determination, and collective action it inspired. It was a story that would be told for generations, that even when power is misused, truth, accountability, and the courage to act can change everything. If this story of courage, justice, and community resilience moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe now to our channel for more powerful real-life stories where ordinary people stand up against corruption, oppression, and injustice and win. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story that inspires, empowers, and reminds us that bravery changes lives. Share this video everywhere you can on WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok so the world sees what happens when families refuse to be silenced and communities fight back. Comment below and tell us what you would do if you witnessed abuse of power. Your voice matters. Your engagement spreads awareness and empowers others to take a stand. Remember, justice isn't just about punishment, it's about protecting the innocent, restoring dignity, and ensuring that every child can celebrate their birthday without fear. Be part of the change. Be part of the story.